5 nuns left St. Marietta Convent after opposing their superior, but only 3 were ever confirmed alive again. The others vanished without explanation. Years later, a desperate journalist uncovers redacted documents, secret transfers, and a rosary dropped in gravel, evidence of something far more sinister hiding behind walls of silence and faith. What really happened to Sister Bernadette and Sister Emilia? The truth, buried in bureaucracy, is finally unraveling. The wind carried the distinct scent of pine through the small, secluded property of St. Marietta Convent in rural Pennsylvania. Fall was descending gently upon the valley, painting the surrounding hills ingredients of amber and rust. Sister Caroline closed the chapel door behind her and paused, letting the silence of the sanctuary cling to her skin for a moment longer before she returned to the duties of the day. A bell echoed faintly across the courtyard, signaling midday prayers, but not everyone was heading toward the chapel. In the garden behind the dormitory, Sister Emilia was bent over a notebook, shielding it with her elbow as she scribbled with careful, deliberate strokes. Her handwriting trembled only slightly, not from cold, but from the weight of what she was putting to paper. She looked up as Sister Bernadette approached, her face solemn. "Is it done?" Bernadette whispered. Emilia nodded, her mouth a thin line. "Almost. I want to double-check the phrasing. We can't afford any mistakes." They were among 5 women who had gathered in quiet defiance over the past 3 months, concerned by the increasingly rigid and punitive leadership of Father Lionel, the new appointed head of the convent. He was not like their former overseer, Father Hewitt, who had lived simply, respected boundaries, and believed in dialogue. Father Lionel's arrival in March marked a shift, not immediately, but insidiously. First came the new schedules, longer prayer vigils, stricter curfews, no exceptions for age or illness. Then came the economic regulations. All personal items, including modest inheritances or family gifts, had to be declared for community use. Cell phones were collected and returned only during specific hours. The infirmary was now locked outside of designated times, with Father Lionel insisting on offering suffering to God, unless there was bleeding or unconsciousness. What frightened them most wasn't his control, it was the subtle way he enforced silence. Disagreements were met with spiritual redirection. Letters home were now to be screened for doctrinal consistency. One sister, young Teresa, tried to push back publicly during group devotions. The next morning she was gone, sent on retreat, they were told, without a chance to say goodbye. She never returned. That was the moment the others knew something was deeply wrong. Sister Margaret, the eldest among the 5, had served in St. Marietta for over 30 years. She rarely involved herself in internal matters, but one morning she stood up in the kitchen after Father Lionel left and simply said, "This is not obedience, this is fear." From there they began to meet in secret, in the garden shed behind the greenhouse, in the basement laundry after dark, or sometimes walking in pairs along the woods, pretending to count medicinal herbs. They gathered records, compared notes, wrote down their recollections. Tonight, the plan was final. Emilia would finish the anonymous letter. Bernadette would scan and print 5 copies at the diocesan office where she volunteered. They would mail them to 3 bishops, one journalist from Pittsburgh whose brother had once attended seminary, and to a retired nun who ran a legal aid center for women religious. They hoped at least one person would read the words and believe them. The letter outlined specific incidents: verbal coercion, financial mismanagement, emotional isolation, and unexplained transfers. It didn't accuse Father Lionel of anything criminal, not yet, but it raised alarms. The sisters included dates, quotes, and even a photo Sister Margaret had taken, discreetly, of the inventory ledger that showed how their pension fund had been reallocated to ecclesial outreach. That evening they met in the unused herb garden by the east wall, a place no one visited since the old gardener passed away. They stood in a circle under the fading light. Sister Lydia held the envelope, heavy with implication. "We're not doing this because we're angry," she said quietly. "We're doing this because we still believe in what this place is supposed to be." They prayed together, not for victory, but for truth. What none of them knew, what no one could have known yet, was that their decision that night would not lead to healing or reform. It would lead to silence and disappearances. Within 2 weeks, the convent received a formal letter from the diocese. Father Lionel had been made aware of discontented and requested reassignment for the 5 sisters for spiritual rejuvenation and reflection. No explanation, no appeal. They were told to pack minimal belongings. They would each be sent to different diocesan properties for temporary placement. That was what the letter said. But the logistics felt wrong. They weren't sent together. Each was asked to wait in her room until a car arrived. Sister Bernadette went first, then Lydia, then Emilia. Margaret was next. Caroline, the quietest, the youngest, was last. She had never spoken at the meetings, only listened. The night she was taken, she had just finished praying the Rosary. Her room was still warm with candlelight when the knock came. No one said goodbye, no one asked questions, and within days, 3 of the 5 were confirmed to have arrived at separate retirement convents, but 2, Emilia and Bernadette, vanished. No one had contact. Their letters, if any were written, never arrived. The convent insisted they were fine. "They've chosen quiet," Father Lionel said during the next Sunday homily. "Let us honor their silence." But Sister Caroline knew silence wasn't always chosen. And now she regretted not speaking more. Sister Caroline sat at the edge of her new cot, the mattress thin and the air thick with the sharp scent of antiseptic and age. The walls of the guest quarters in the retreat house were lined with crucifixes, each one a silent witness to countless prayers and confessions over the years. Her suitcase, small and half unpacked, leaned against the leg of a worn dresser, its brass handle dulled with time. She hadn't touched it since she arrived 3 days ago. There had been no formal greeting when the dark gray sedan dropped her at St. Agnes Rest Center for Sisters just outside Harrisburg. No one explained why she was here. An elderly nun had handed her keys and murmured, "Welcome," then shuffled away down the hall. Caroline hadn't seen her again. She tried not to overthink things. After all, the diocesan letter had assured them this was temporary, a period of rest and reflection. And she was told she would resume her mission work soon, but her unease grew with each passing day. In those first few nights, she managed to get through to Lydia by phone. Lydia had been reassigned to a retreat center in Connecticut, and though she tried to sound positive, her tone held an edge of caution. "They're watching closely," Lydia had whispered. "My letters are screened. I had to wait until lights out to call you. Be careful, Caroline. They know more than they say." Margaret, transferred to a health facility in Ohio, had also reached out briefly. Her call was straightforward, almost businesslike, but before hanging up, she added, "Check on the others, Emilia and Bernadette. I haven't heard a word." That sentence stayed with Caroline like a thorn under the skin. No one had heard from Emilia or Bernadette since they were picked up. It had been over 10 days now. Initially, Caroline told herself they were simply at more remote facilities or still settling in. Maybe their phones had been taken, maybe they were too tired, but the silence pressed heavier each day. Emilia, meticulous and protective, would have sent something by now. A postcard, a prayer card, even a coded note if she feared interception. Bernadette, fierce and vocal, wouldn't have let this pass quietly. Their absence was unnatural. On the 12th day, Caroline broke protocol. During her hour of permitted quiet administrative time, a vague slot carved into their daily schedule, she borrowed a sister's computer in the library and drafted a carefully worded email to the diocesan central office. She posed as a concerned relative of Sister Bernadette, claiming she hadn't heard from her in nearly 2 weeks and wanted to ensure she had arrived safely. She used a non-institutional email address and omitted her own name. She clicked send and closed the laptop, her heart hammering so loudly she feared the librarian could hear it. The reply came faster than expected, within an hour. It was brief, too brief, and signed only Office of Religious Assignments. The message read, "We appreciate your concern. Due to privacy and health considerations, we cannot disclose the whereabouts of individual sisters currently undergoing transitional or reflective assignments. Rest assured, all are receiving appropriate care in line with their vocation. Thank you for respecting this process." The sterile tone unsettled her. No confirmation of safety, no acknowledgement of names. Caroline sat frozen for several minutes, staring at the words. Transitional or reflective assignments. What did that mean? The others had been able to call. Why not Emilia or Bernadette? And what kind of health considerations required complete silence? That night, Caroline didn't sleep. Instead, she replayed every moment of their last week together at St. Marietta. She remembered Bernadette standing in the herb garden, face half lit by twilight, insisting they document everything. She remembered Emilia slipping the envelope into her coat pocket, her lips pressed in prayer. Most of all, she remembered the suddenness of the departures, how no one said goodbye, how the cars came silently, how Father Lionel had been strangely calm during morning prayers, as if he already knew everything that would follow. 2 days later, Caroline made another attempt, this time with subtlety. During a scheduled call with a cousin, she asked if they had heard anything from the sisters at St. Mariette. She dropped Emilia and Bernadette's names casually, as if reminiscing. Her cousin paused. Actually, no. I used to get little notes from Bernadette around holidays. She never missed my birthday. But come to think of it, I haven't heard anything this month. You think everything's all right? Caroline lied. She said yes. Then she ended the call and walked outside, past the small statue of St. Francis, past the hedges, carefully trimmed by volunteers, until she reached the edge of the retreat center where the woods began. It was quiet there, no cameras, no prying eyes. She sat on the stone bench and pulled out a folded scrap of paper. It was a partial list Emilia had made, dates, locations, one-sentence notations, tracking discrepancies in supply orders and finance reports linked to Father Lionel. Caroline had kept it, not knowing why. Now it felt heavier than ever. She stared at the paper until the sun dipped low behind the trees, painting everything in bruised gold. She knew this silence wasn't accidental. She knew something had gone wrong. The question now was how far it had gone, and who else knew. By the third week, Sister Caroline's unease had shifted into quiet determination. The reply from the diocesan office continued to echo in her thoughts, its neutrality more suspicious than reassuring. She had kept her communication efforts discreet, but the growing silence from both Emilia and Bernadette felt like an alarm no one else could hear. Then, without warning, something changed. Caroline received a call from an unknown number on a Monday morning. It was Bernadette's younger sister, Megan, a nurse practitioner from Pittsburgh, whose voice trembled as she asked, "Have you heard from my sister? It's been over 3 weeks. She never just disappears like this." Caroline hesitated, aware she was being monitored, then simply replied, "No, I haven't." Megan's tone shifted. "Well, I filed a missing persons report yesterday. The police weren't exactly helpful, said she's an adult not legally obligated to stay in touch. But I've known my sister my whole life. She wouldn't vanish without saying a word." Something's wrong. Megan's decision triggered a chain reaction. The report was processed, but not prioritized, logged with the note, "Subject is an adult religious sister, possible voluntary withdrawal from religious life." Caroline would later learn that the officer in charge had made a routine call to the local parish, where a senior cleric confirmed that transfers and sabbaticals were common, and that the sister in question is likely on retreat or reassignment, as per internal protocol. The file was left open but inactive. No search was conducted, no follow-up was planned. Still, Megan didn't let it rest. A week later, a brief notice appeared in the local paper. "Family seeks information regarding Sister Bernadette Hayes, last seen departing St. Marietta Convent in early October." The small paragraph was buried in the back section, but it reached the eyes of someone who mattered. Janice Kimmel, a freelance investigative journalist based in central Pennsylvania, had been covering religious life stories for over a decade. She'd once spent a year embedded in a Benedictine community for a series on women in cloistered orders and had earned the respect of multiple diocesan leaders, though her questions often made them uncomfortable. When she saw Bernadette's name, something clicked. Janice had interviewed her 2 years prior at a public health outreach event run by the convent. She remembered her energy, her clarity, and her willingness to speak plainly. The idea that someone like that could vanish, quietly, with no records and no concern from those in power, bothered her deeply. Janice began making calls. She contacted the sheriff's department and asked if the case was being followed up. The deputy she spoke to gave a half-hearted answer. "She's a nun. Those people move around all the time. Their hierarchy doesn't always tell the families where they go." Janice asked, "Did you verify that she's still alive?" The line went silent for a beat. "Ma'am, we have no evidence to suggest a crime. There's no reason to escalate this unless we get more." That was all Janice needed to hear. The next day, Janice drove to Harrisburg and lingered near the retreat center, where she'd heard a few sisters had been reassigned. It was a long shot, but she waited at the small garden gate until she spotted a woman in habit walking alone toward the outer chapel. "Sister?" she called out gently. The woman paused, her posture stiff. Janice didn't recognize her at first, but as she approached, the light caught the edge of her profile. It was Caroline. Caroline didn't speak at first. She scanned the area behind Janice, clearly nervous. "How did you know I was here?" she asked. "A notice in the paper, and an old contact who works intake for diocesan transfers. He didn't give me names, but I connected the dots," Janice replied calmly. Caroline hesitated, clearly torn. Then she whispered, "Walk with me," but not for long. They strolled in silence for several minutes along the gravel path behind the chapel. Finally, Caroline stopped beneath a dogwood tree and said, "No one's supposed to talk to outsiders, especially not journalists." Janice nodded. "I understand, but people are disappearing. This isn't normal. I don't believe they're all just away on silent retreat." Caroline glanced around again. Her voice was low, almost inaudible. "They separated us. The day they moved us, they told us we'd be reassigned as a group, but none of us were sent to the same location. We weren't even told where the others were going." It wasn't a transition, it was dispersal. Janice's eyes narrowed. "Were you warned?" Carolyn shook her head. "No one that we'd said. I still don't know where Emilia or Bernadette were sent. No one will tell me." Janice reached into her coat and handed Caroline a small notepad. "If you remember any details, dates, people, conversations, write 'em down. It can be vague, just enough to start a timeline." Caroline hesitated before taking it, her fingers brushing the edge as if it might burn. "I don't know if I can help, but I'll try." She turned to leave, but before she walked away, she sensed her instinct. "It started long before they reassigned us." Janice stood still long after Caroline had disappeared down the path. She knew what Caroline had just confirmed was enough to pursue the story. The pattern was forming: internal protest, forced dispersals, complete communication, complete isolation of specific individuals. But she needed more, and she knew just where to start digging next. Janice parked her car a few blocks from the Chancery Building in Allentown, a discreet three-story brick complex nestled between a retired bank and a small Italian deli. Her meeting had not been formally scheduled. Instead, she had used the name of a retired Monsignor she had once profiled to gain a brief audience with Sister Miriam, the diocesan archivist. Carrying a thin leather folder, Janice rehearsed the phrasing she would use: respectful but direct, curious but not accusatory. She knew that access to internal convent records was rare, often impossible without legal pressure, but she hoped that with careful wording and a little professional tact, she could at least glimpse a paper trail. The receptionist escorted her down a narrow hallway that smelled faintly of wax and old paper. Sister Miriam, a severe-looking woman in her late 60s, met her at the door of a small office lined wall-to-wall with locked cabinets and framed certificates. "You said you're working on a historical piece," the sister asked, motioning Janice to sit. "Yes," Janice replied smoothly, "specifically regarding St. Marietta's administrative transitions. I'm hoping to better understand the period when Father Lionel replaced Father Hewitt." Miriam's expression remained neutral, but her eyes sharpened. "That appointment was made in March last year," she said. "A fairly standard reassignment." Janice nodded. "I understand, but I've come across references to some internal restructuring, possibly spiritual formation changes, new resource policies, and even altered reporting systems for sisters under mission assignments. I wanted to cross references if there were any written communications about that period." She kept her tone even. "Anything that could help clarify how the convent responded to those shifts." Sister Miriam's fingers interlaced over her desk. "I'm afraid access to personnel and spiritual records is strictly limited. These are private matters pertaining to the internal life of religious women under canonical guidance," Janice pressed gently. "Even if identities are redacted? I'm not seeking personal confessions or evaluations, only general patterns, calendar entries, budget notes, anything that helps me understand context." Miriam's smile was polite but cold. The Church recognizes the sanctity of vocational privacy. Unless you have a formal court order or ecclesiastical endorsement, I cannot grant any review of documents from St. Marietta or its personnel. That policy is consistent across all communities under our jurisdiction. Janice's jaw tightened. She nodded, thanked the sister, and left without further protest, but a chill ran through her. The refusal wasn't surprising, but the absolute wall of silence, paired with the vague language around vocational privacy, felt designed to shield something. Outside, she called Carolyn. They hadn't spoken in several days, and her voice came over the line strained, almost hoarse. "I can't talk long," she said. "They're reviewing phone logs now." Janice quickly relayed the dead end at the chancery and asked, "Do you remember if Bernadette or Emilia had ever pushed back against Father Lionel directly? In meetings, in writing, anything formal?" "Not in writing." "But yes, I was there the night it happened." Her voice dropped lower. "It was early September. We were all called into the small hall for a formation session. Father Lionel was leading it. The theme was obedient silence. He said that, as sisters, we were not to question reassignments or fiscal decisions, that God would bless submission. Janice stayed silent, letting her talk. Bernadette stood up. She was shaking, but she said, "This is not spiritual direction, Father. This is domination cloaked in Scripture. You are using faith to control us." Caroline exhaled. The room went quiet. He said nothing for a full minute. Then he dismissed the meeting. The next day she was removed from her regular duties and reassigned to kitchen rotation. A week later she disappeared. Janice scribbled in her notebook. "What about Emilia?" Caroline's voice caught slightly. She didn't speak in that meeting, but 2 days later she tried to contact the diocese ombudsman. She borrowed my phone and said she had documentation of irregularly missing stipend receipts. But the line cut off after 2 minutes. She told me that night, "If I go quiet, you know why." Janice's pen hovered above the page. "Did she say what kind of documentation she had?" "Not clearly," Caroline replied, "but she kept a small leather journal. She said she wrote down everything, dates, who signed what, even things she overheard." Janice paused. "Where is that journal now?" "Gone," Caroline whispered. "Where is that journal now?" "Gone," Caroline whispered. "When I went to her room 2 days after she left, it was bare. Even her Bible was missing. No one takes a nun's Bible, not unless they're trying to erase her." Janice ended the call shortly after, her thoughts tangled. 2 women had voiced concern. One openly accused their superior of abuse of power, the other tried to document it. Now both were missing. The chancery's stonewalling made sense in that light. She suspected they knew more, or at the very least, feared what the records might reveal. She needed that journal, or a copy, or even a hint of where it had gone. The deeper she went, the more obvious it became that someone had started cleaning up long before anyone outside had begun asking questions. After the failed attempt to access any archival records and the increasingly specific accounts from Sister Caroline, Janice shifted her strategy. If the institutional walls remained sealed, she would have to go around them, speaking not to active clergy or current administrators, but to those once employed on the periphery, people who saw things, perhaps without fully understanding what they were seeing at the time. She started with maintenance logs, names buried in back issues of local newsletters, and eventually found a lead. Walter Eddington, now 73, had worked as a night shift security guard at St. Marietta Convent for 12 years before retiring shortly after the pandemic began. A lifelong resident of Carbon County, Walter was known for keeping to himself, rarely attending parish events, and living with his sister in a modest, single-story house tucked behind a hardware store. It took Janice 3 days to find someone who would give her his number and another 2 to convince him to meet. They sat under a steel awning behind the fire station, the autumn wind pushing at a stack of napkins between them. Walter wore a worn Veterans of Foreign Wars baseball cap and thick glasses that magnified his already cautious eyes. "I don't know what I saw," he began, "but I never forgot it." Janice didn't interrupt. She let the silence pull him forward. Walter continued. "It was sometime last October. I was doing rounds at the back lot near the service entrance, around 10:30, I think. That part of the property's mostly dark at night. Only one floodlight was working then. I saw one of the convent vans pull up. Not unusual. They sometimes took the sisters out for appointments or retreats, but this was late, and there were two men I didn't recognize. They weren't clergy, civilian clothes. One was driving, the other stood by the side door. He scratched his temple. I was about to step forward, ask what was going on, but then I saw Sister Bernadette, and right behind her, Sister Emilia, both wearing coats over their habits. They weren't carrying bags, and they weren't talking, just walking slow, like they were being led. Janice leaned forward. Did they seem distressed? Walter frowned. Not visibly, but something wasn't right. Emilia glanced back once. Not at me, but at the chapel tower, like she was saying goodbye. He exhaled slowly. I didn't ask questions that night. They got in, the van pulled away, and that was it. I never saw either of them again. A few days later, I asked Sister Pauline, she handled night assignments, if they were on retreat. She just smiled and said, "They've moved on to deeper service." It fell off. After that, I kept my head down. Janice was quiet, processing the details. Are you sure it was them? The lighting was poor and... Walter shook his head. I remember because of this. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small drawstring pouch. From it, he carefully withdrew a rosary, simple and worn, with a broken clasp. I found this 10 minutes after the van left. It was lying in the gravel where Emilia had walked. I knew it was hers. She always kept it looped on the side of her belt. Said her grandmother gave it to her at first vow. He ran a thumb along the wooden beads. I've kept it since. Didn't know why. Maybe I thought she'd come back for it, but no one asked. Janice stared at the rosary, the beads dulled by time but unmistakably personal. It wasn't evidence in the legal sense, but it was a link, a tangible trace of presence at a specific moment. May I photograph it? She asked. Walter hesitated, then nodded. She snapped 3 photos under the fading light and noted the time, date, and location. Did you ever report this? She asked gently. He gave a bitter smile. Report what? That I saw a nun leave in a van? That she dropped her rosary? There's nothing illegal about transfers, and no one would believe it was strange unless they already suspected something. Back then, I wasn't sure what to think. Janice tucked her notebook away. Do you think now it was voluntary? Walter looked off into the hills. I don't think they had a choice. You don't leave a convent at night with no suitcase and no words. You don't leave your grandmother's rosary unless you're not the one deciding to leave. Janice thanked him, leaving with more than she'd hoped for. The next morning she returned to the path behind the retreat center where she had first met Caroline. This time she brought a printed photo of the rosary and a short transcript of Walter's recollection. She waited at the statue of St. Elizabeth, watching as sisters passed in pairs or alone, until finally Caroline emerged near the greenhouse. Her expression was drawn, her steps quick. Janice approached and gently handed her the envelope. Caroline opened it, her eyes scanning the image first, then the transcript. Her lips parted. That's hers, she whispered. Emily never let that rosary out of her sight, not once. She even had the clasp repaired twice after it broke in the garden. Janice watched her closely. This confirms the timeline. They were moved, not transferred, taken, and someone made sure it happened, without questions. Caroline nodded, her knuckles tightening around the envelope. If they had warned us, if they had even hinted. She didn't finish. The wind rustled the chapel bells in the distance. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Then Caroline looked up. There's something else, not in writing, but it might lead you closer. Janice tilted her head. What is it? Caroline glanced back toward the retreat center. There's a priest, retired, used to visit Father Lionel during his early months at St. Marietta. They met privately, often at night. His name is Father O'Neill. He used to be diocesan auditor before he was encouraged into retirement. He may know what really happened to the disappearances. Janice sat at a corner table in a modest cafe tucked behind an old stone parish in West Reading, Pennsylvania, her recorder discreetly hidden beneath a stack of printed articles and notebooks. Across from her sat Sister Helen McTavish, a retired nun in her early 70s, with silver hair pulled tightly into a bun, glasses perched low on her nose, and a calm demeanor that seemed untouched by time or scandal. She had served over 4 decades in various orders across the state, including a 6-year period at St. Marietta until her retirement last spring. Janice had reached out through a retired teachers association, posing her inquiry as a project on religious financial transparency. It wasn't a lie, just not the whole truth. To her surprise, Sister Helen responded not with suspicion, but with a quiet invitation to meet. Now, sipping tea and glancing occasionally out the window as if checking for interruptions, the retired sister began to speak. "I worked in the administrative office for 3 years at St. Marietta," she said slowly, "mostly helping coordinate donations, preparing monthly reports, organizing logistics for mission trips. Nothing glamorous, but I paid attention, and I remember the shifts when Father Lionel arrived. Suddenly, many things were no longer discussed openly." Janice leaned forward slightly. "Can you be specific?" Helen nodded. "The charitable giving accounts, money earmarked for refugee services, food pantries, literacy programs. We used to handle all those distributions at the convent level. I would prepare detailed quarterly reports and file copies both locally and with the diocesan office." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "But starting early last year, Father Lionel began redirecting those funds. He said the new focus was on internal formation and sustainability. I questioned it. Not openly, God knows that wasn't safe, but I raised a concern during a routine check-in. He smiled and said the diocese had approved the shift. When I asked for written confirmation, he told me it was confidential and above my pay grade." She looked down at her teacup. "After that, I was removed from access to the accounts. No warning, no explanation. They assigned Sister Margaret to take over my duties. She was older and easier to control." Janice took detailed notes. "Did any of the younger sisters question it, particularly the ones involved in the financial side?" Helen's eyes sharpened. At her eyes, and remember Emilia being especially cautious. She had a background in basic accounting, not formal training, but enough to notice patterns. One afternoon she came to me in the laundry room, completely out of routine, and asked if I had ever compared the outgoing donations between 2019 and 2021. I told her I had, and that something didn't add up. She said, and I remember this exactly, "If the food budget is down and the mission support is paused, why are the withdrawals increasing?" Helen set her cup down gently. A few days later, I heard she intended to send a private report to the diocesan's financial office. She said she would use her cousin's address to avoid mail screening, but she told me she was advised by someone in-house to wait until after the regional spiritual summit. Supposedly, the matter would be addressed in closed session. Janice frowned. "Who advised her to wait?" Helen hesitated. "I can't say with certainty. I wasn't present. But based on the timing and the people she was seen speaking with, it was likely Father Lionel himself, perhaps framed as friendly advice, but more likely a warning." Janice asked, "And the report? Did it ever go out? If it did, no one ever acknowledged it. Emilia disappeared not long after. I remember the tension that week. She wasn't eating much, barely spoke during evening prayers. Then she was gone. No farewell, no explanation. They told us she'd been called to a medical sabbatical, but no details were shared. And after that, everyone stopped asking." Janice scribbled fast, absorbing the structure of what was unfolding. Financial misappropriation disguised as spiritual reallocation. Independent verification obstructed under the veil of ecclesiastical process. A whistleblower dissuaded by promises of internal resolution. And then, silence. It fit the pattern of calculated containment. "Did anyone else raise flags?" she asked. Riven replied. Helen replied. "Bernadette tried. She wasn't as subtle. In a community session, she asked why we were investing in repairs for non-functional buildings while cutting funds for literacy supplies. She framed it politely, but everyone knew it was a challenge." She lowered her voice. "After that, she was placed on quiet duty, cleaning, kitchen prep, strip of teaching assignments. They called it rotation, but it was punishment." Helen paused. 2 months later, she was gone too. Janice closed her notebook and looked up. "Sister Helen, would you be willing to testify to any of this, even informally?" Helen looked out the window again, considering. "I'm old, Miss Kimmel. I've seen too much to be naive, but too little to think I'll change the world. Not in court, not unless others step forward too. They'd tear me apart in canon law before I could reach a microphone." Janice understood. "Even this helps. It confirms we're not chasing shadows." Helen gave a faint smile. They never use force directly. It's all structure. Policy, reassignment, obedience. You sign a vow, then they use that vow to bury your voice. As Janice left the cafe, wind lifting the hem of her coat, she looked over her notes again. Emilia had noticed the numbers. She had prepared to send a report. She had been advised, possibly threatened, to wait. Then she vanished. Bernadette spoke out, was reassigned, then disappeared as well. A network of silence built on the foundation of devotion and protocol. And yet cracks were forming. Helen had spoken. Caroline had kept records. Walter had seen the van. The pieces were still incomplete, but the outline was growing clearer. Now she needed to follow the money itself and trace the names connected to its diversion. Janice pulled into the faculty parking lot of Widener University Commonwealth Law School, just as the afternoon sun dipped behind the West College of Close Canal to ensure the deadly corrosive patchment. She had been invited by a small group of students who had reached out after reading one of her blog entries summarizing suspicious activity in cloistered institutions. The message came from Leo Martinez, a second-year law student with a concentration in nonprofit compliance and ecclesiastical finance. Leo's email had been short but direct. "We think we found something in the diocesan budget records. 3 revisions, 1 line item spike. It aligns with your missing sister timeline. Want to talk?" Janice hadn't hesitated. Now, in a modest conference room inside the law school's older annex building, she found herself seated at a round table cluttered with printouts, highlighters, and 2 laptops humming softly in standby mode. Leo, lanky and sharply focused, clicked open a spreadsheet projected on a pull-down screen. "This is the public financial summary for the diocese that oversees St. Marietta," he began, pointing to a column labeled Fiscal Year 2022. This document's first version was archived in June, then revised again in September, and a final version was uploaded in December. All 3 are technically public, but no version notes or justifications were logged for the changes. We compared line by line. He scrolled quickly and stopped at row 114, labeled Special Pastoral and Health Allocations. This category historically includes elder care, psychological retreats, private therapy sessions for clergy, and sometimes palliative housing for aging religious. For 5 years straight, this line floated around 85 to 90,000 annually. But look, starting in the September revision last year, it jumped to 172,000. In December, it stayed the same. No explanation, no breakdown. Janice squinted at the screen. "That's almost double." Leo nodded. "It gets better, or worse. The date on the revision? September 29, less than 10 days after the last confirmed contact with Sister Emilia, and exactly 1 week after the disappearance of Sister Bernadette. I cross-referenced the changelog, timestamps with your timeline. It's not just suggestive, it's nearly synchronous." One of the other students, a quiet young woman named Priya, added, "We pulled similar financials from 2 other nearby dioceses just to check for pattern distortion. None of them showed a jump in that category. This wasn't inflation or a regional trend. This was internal." Janice scribbled notes rapidly. "Can you show the audit trail? The metadata on who accessed and changed the files?" Leo hesitated. "That's the tricky part. The diocese servers strip identifying info from public logs, but the initial upload came from an IP registered to the diocesan's treasurer's office. The second came through a secure tunnel, probably a remote login. The third? That one came through the chancery." He glanced at Priya, who added, "We also noticed that 2 grant requests were pulled mid-cycle, one for a women's shelter in Schuylkill County and one for a food program in Lancaster. Both were listed as temporarily suspended due to internal redirection of resources. No further updates. It's like money was suddenly siphoned off for someone, without any external accountability." Janice stared at the numbers, the phrasing, the subtle shifts masked as ordinary line item tweaks. "Do we have any way to know what the funds actually went toward?" Leo shook his head. "Tillman, without subpoena access or whistleblower testimony. But we do know this. Starting in October of last year, a previously dormant LLC linked to a religious medical retreat in upstate New York received 2 wire transfers totaling $91,000. The LLC is owned by a management group with one clerical member, Father Jonathan O'Neill. Janice froze. O'Neill? Caroline just mentioned him. Retired priest, used to be diocesan auditor, said he was close to Father Lionel during the early months of his reassignment. Leo tapped a tab and pulled up an organizational chart and chairs the Mission Resource Preservation Committee, which technically oversees properties used for extended spiritual recovery. It's a shell designation. They own 2 small facilities registered as private religious residences. Both are gated. Neither has listed capacity, but one of them had an ambulance dispatch recorded last December. No report was filed with public MAS logs. Priya leaned forward. And get this, the location filed for tax-exempt status under the category Religious Convalescence Center. It's not listed on any diocesan maps or public outreach pages. It's as if it's meant to exist in the background. Janice's heart pounded. That's where they went. Or at least, where someone went. Those funds weren't for programs or services. They were for containment. It's circumstantial, but it's stacked. Revisions to budget, withdrawn grants, sudden influx to a shadow facility, and a spike in costs labeled as special health care. We believe they diverted diocesan funds to pay for long-term isolation of dissenting sisters. Possibly off the books, possibly without consent. Janice nodded, slowly feeling the tension coil inside her. Then we find the facility, we find O'Neill, and we ask real questions. Leo lowered his voice. There's one more thing, the rosary, the one the guard found. He tapped open a side folder. That kind of item isn't just sentimental, it's personal property. If Emilia had been voluntarily relocated, she would have taken it. But if she was moved against her will, and they wanted to avoid questions, they'd control what she carried. That rosary, dropped at the last moment, could have been the only clue she had time to leave. Janice stared at the screen again, the line of numbers blurring slightly. We follow the money. And we follow the rosary. The document arrived folded inside a plain manila envelope with no return address. Janice found it tucked into her mailbox at the co-working space she used for research. The handwriting on the label printed in neat block letters, Confidentiality for Kim L. She opened it with a letter opener, careful not to tear the contents, and slid out 3 sheets of paper, photocopies of what appeared to be a patient admission summary, an internal evaluation note, and a discharge instruction sheet. Each page bore the same identifier, patient initials, BH. Date of intake, Oct. 4, 2022. Her heart thumped as she scanned the first page. Patient presented with symptoms consistent with acute psychological distress, elevated heart rate, dehydration, intermittent disorientation. Initial exam revealed no signs of physical trauma, but noted prolonged sleep deprivation and suppressed verbal response patterns. Patient transported under private custodial escort, not accompanied by medical personnel. Janice read the details again. The initials matched Bernadette Hayes. The intake date was 1 week after her last known appearance at St. Marietta. The escort was not listed by name, but under Quan Center, Counter-Respirateur Conversion, Tax Return. At the bottom, the facility name confirmed her growing suspicion. Pinwell Integrated Retreat and Recovery Center, Elk County, PA. Janet sat back, eyes darting between the pages. The second sheet was more clinical, a therapist's handwritten observation. Patient resists open dialogue when prompted about source of distress, cites ecclesial pressure and spiritualized obligation. Avoids eye contact when religious figures are mentioned, expresses fear of being returned to prior environment, requests rosary 3 times but withdrew when offered substitute. Janet blinked. Requested rosary. The detail cut sharply. Emilia's rosary. Dropped that night. This was Bernadette, isolated, dehydrated, terrified, and desperate for something familiar. The final page was dated October 16. It listed a discharge notice, but instead of a forward destination, it read, Transferred for continued supervised recovery, confidential placement per religious authority. There was no signature from family, no attending physician name, only a stamp authorized by order representative, clearance code 9. Janice called Leo immediately. I got a partial medical file. Bernadette. She was taken to a private therapy facility. No hospital record, treated off-grid. She read the notes aloud, Leo interrupting only once to say, Elk County? That's over 100 miles northwest of St. Marietta. That's not a retreat. It's an intentional removal. Janice continued. She was admitted under duress. They listed spiritual obligation as the cause. No legal holds, no formal consent, just custodial escort and clearance by the order. Leo responded. That matches everything we feared. They didn't just isolate them, they institutionalized them. Over the next 2 days, Janice traced Pinewell's licensing. It was registered as a private religious therapeutic facility under Pennsylvania's Alternative Recovery Act, which allowed for spiritual care exemptions in mental health treatment so long as the patient was referred internally and not under civil detention. It required no external reporting unless abuse was alleged, and since Bernadette had technically entered under pastoral supervision, the center bore no responsibility for public notification. The dots connected, the finance revisions, the rise in special pastoral care expenses, and now a living trace of one of the missing sisters placed in a holding facility outside traditional medical oversight. Janice made the drive out on a gray Thursday. The roads narrowed as she neared Elk County, winding past abandoned barns and pine thickets until Pinewell's signage emerged, discreet, almost pastoral. A narrow gravel road led up to a gated complex that looked more like a spiritual retreat than a clinic. Wooden buildings, a chapel with a copper roof, and no marked ambulance bays or security fences. She parked at the visitor's station and approached the front desk with a pre-written cover story. "I'm researching religious therapeutic programs for a statewide publication," she told the attendant, a middle-aged woman in pale green scrubs who smiled politely but offered nothing beyond generic pamphlets. "We're proud to support clergy and religious seeking rest and reflection," the woman said. "Most of our guests are under spiritual direction, and we value their privacy." Jan asked if the program accepted referrals from St. Marietta. The woman nodded vaguely. "We don't discuss specific partnerships, but we've welcomed guests from many communities." She pressed further. "Would Bernadette Hayes be among them?" The smile faded. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I can't confirm or deny anyone's presence or history with us. That information is protected." Janice didn't expect a direct answer. She left with a brochure, her mind spinning. If Bernadette had been treated here, and the documents strongly suggested she had, then someone within the church infrastructure had authorized her removal and ensured she remained hidden from public and familial inquiry. The phrase, "continued supervised recovery," on the discharge form echoed ominously. Where had she gone next? Janice returned to her car and sat in silence. She checked the time, then sent a secure message to Leo with images of the medical notes. "Confirmed. Facility matches paper trail. No civil oversight." A minute later, Leo responded, "We've found something on O'Neill. He filed a travel expense reimbursement on Oct 15, same day Bernadette was transferred. Destination listed as Erie, but car mileage aligns with route to Pinwell. He may have been the one who picked her up." Janice met Anthony Delacroix on a late October morning under overcast skies outside a quiet parish office in Lebanon County. A former diocesan secretary who had served under Bishop Reginald Hartwell for 5 years, Anthony had reached out via an encrypted message board used by whistleblowers in religious institutions, one Janice had posted on weeks earlier. His initial message had been cautious, cryptic even, but after she verified his identity and previous employment, he agreed to meet under strict anonymity. Now, in his late 30s, Anthony dressed plainly in a fleece jacket and worn jeans, carrying a messenger bag filled with old files and legal pads. His face was tired but alert, as if years of silence had conditioned him to expect the worst with every truth he spoke. "I can't show you everything," he said, as they sat at a table in the corner of a deserted cafe. "But I kept copies of documents I was never meant to see, documents that made me leave." He pulled out a printed memo, 3 pages long, with a header clearly marked "Internal for Episcopal Review Only." Janice leaned in as he unfolded the pages. The text was typed in a dense, bureaucratic tone. The opening paragraph referenced behavioral reassignment protocols initiated under the authority of Pastoral Unity Guidelines. A highlighted section read, In light of growing tensions among junior religious personnel and to preserve communal spiritual equilibrium, we recommend transition of identified individuals whose actions and expressions may undermine cohesion. Janice's eyes narrowed. Identified individuals? Anthony nodded grimly. That's what they called it, a vague classification. The names were redacted before it was sent to the bishop, but I saw the original draft. There were 2 names typed clearly before someone blacked them out and reprinted. One of them was Bernadette, the other, Emilia. Janice's breath caught. So this was formalized, not an accident, not a misunderstanding. Anthony confirmed. It was processed through the Chancery's Health and Wellness Liaison, filed under non-disciplinary intervention. That's why they never filed civil reports or police notices. As far as they were concerned, these women weren't missing. They were removed, strategically. He opened a second folder and slid across another document. This is the inventory log from the Office of Religious Support Services, ORS. Each transvasile case receives a file number. They're tracked by initials, not names, for confidentiality. But on this page, he pointed to 2 entries near the bottom. You'll see something interesting. Intake record 772 Abe and 773 Ep. These were processed within 36 hours of each other. Labeled Direction 9B, same code that appears on the discharge paperwork you found from Pinewell. Janice quickly cross-referenced her notes. The initials matched, or they're filed officially, even as their families searched and asked questions. They were being documented as part of an internal realignment. Anthony nodded. With coded language to prevent outside scrutiny, community impact, spiritual rehabilitation, non-disciplinary health measures. It's all designed to be impenetrable from the outside, but the pattern is there. Janice leaned back slightly, the realization washing over her in cold, measured waves. They created an administrative shell around isolation, and when pressed, they used the appearance of order to deflect any accusation of wrongdoing, Anthony added, and they buried it in volumes of policy language. Unless you know what you're looking for, you'd miss it entirely. But that list, those intake numbers, can be matched against real people, and they only assigned those numbers to women who had shown resistance or requested intervention from outside the chain of command, Janice asked. Did anyone ever object? Anthony hesitated. One auxiliary bishop raised concerns about the precedent. Said that conflating emotional health with disobedience blurred the line between care and control. His objections were noted. Nothing changed. He was reassigned 6 months later to a rural diocese in Montana. Janice was silent for a long moment. And you? Why did you keep the files? Anthony looked away. Because I saw what it did to them. I wasn't close to Bernadette or Emilia, but I passed them in the halls. I read their profiles, their contributions. They weren't unstable, they were brave, and when they spoke, the system responded not with dialogue, but with disappearance. I couldn't stop it then, but I can't forget it either. He slid one last page across the table. This was the list sent to Pinewell for intake prep. 2 entries. No names, only initials and notes. Requires supervised integration, elevated stress, potential for dissent, spiritual overexpression. Janice's voice cracked as she read the words. Spiritual overexpression had become a threat. Rebellion. Not disobedience, just honesty. Anthony folded the folders and stood. This is all I can give, but it should be enough. He looked at her solemnly. Find the others. If any are left, find them before they disappear into a number and a folder no one ever opens again. The story broke on a cold Wednesday morning. Janice had prepared her report meticulously, cross-verified every document, anonymized sensitive sources, and worked with a trusted editorial team to ensure the legal grounds were solid. The headline ran in stark font on the regional paper's homepage by 6:15 a.m. Former nuns silenced, allegations of secret transfers and religious detention in local convent. Within hours, the story had been shared across major social media platforms, picked up by independent watchdogs, and forwarded to advocacy groups focusing on religious institutional abuse. The diocese issued a brief statement that afternoon denying misconduct, but confirming a review of pastoral health protocols in response to public interest. That same evening, a follow-up press release quietly posted on the convent's now archived website admitted to the transfer of two sisters for extended mental health treatment under the guidance of ecclesial healthcare advisors. The release stated that the decisions were based on internal assessments of spiritual strain and risk to communal balance, and that while families were not directly consulted at the time of transfer, the process followed canonical provisions allowing for discretionary pastoral care. The language, cloaked in clerical nuance, confirmed what Janice and her team had suspected all along. Bernadette and Emilia were never consulted, never protected, and never allowed to advocate for themselves. They had been classified, processed, and removed. 2 days later, a former nurse from Pinewell, emboldened by the sudden flood of attention, sent Janice a signed affidavit, along with copies of an internal incident log. Dated February 17, 2023, the log recorded a critical care escalation involving patient ID 772BH. The patient, identified only by initials, was described as having suffered from severe electrolyte imbalances, exacerbated by chronic dehydration and untreated endocrine issues. The log noted a delay in calling emergency services due to directive-based oversight, a euphemism Jarrett's recognized from previous documents indicating clerical discretion. The nurse's affidavit added detail: patient exhibited signs of physical decline over several weeks. Requests for external evaluation were denied. She was transferred to a private hospice suite within the facility and passed away on February 23, 2022. The date, Janice noted grimly, was only 5 months after Bernadette was last seen leaving the convent, in silence. In a follow-up call with a regional health investigator, Janice confirmed that no death certificate had been publicly issued under the name Bernadette Hayes in that jurisdiction. Instead, the record existed under a clerical pseudonym, Max Hale, listed as a private care recipient under religious directive. Her body had been cremated within 72 hours of death, per a standing health protocol submitted by the facility's administrator. There was no autopsy, no funeral mass, no family notification. Just a line in a ledger and a quiet removal from the world. Emilia, however, was another matter. The same nurse's affidavit included a reference to patient 773ES, still active in treatment, but listed under a modified name, Eliza Stone. She was described as stable, nonverbal in spiritual dialogue, engaged in routine, but lacks external communication privileges. When Janice attempted to request a visit through Pinewell's administration, she was told that Miss Stone was under ecclesiastical privacy protection and that no external visits were allowed without authorization from her order. Multiple advocacy groups began petitioning the Department of Health and Human Services to intervene, arguing that the use of religious cover to suppress basic rights, constitutional overreach, and potential human rights violation. Public pressure mounted rapidly. A protest formed outside the diocesan office, small but persistent. Caroline, the quiet sister who had first broken silence, stepped forward at a local town hall, stating publicly, they called it spiritual protection, but it was abandonment. They used God's name to strip away choice, voice, and dignity. If Emilia's still alive, she deserves freedom, and Bernadette deserves truth. Her voice, steady and clear, drew applause, and several former convent staff members began reaching out to Janice with offers to corroborate timelines, report subtle forms of pressure, and testify to systemic fear under Father Lionel's leadership. That pressure, combined with the public outcry, forced the diocese to hold an emergency press briefing. Bishop Hartwell, flanked by legal advisors and spokespersons, confirmed that a full review is underway and admitted past procedural errors in handling internal welfare assessments. Though no formal apology was issued, he acknowledged that greater transparency must guide our future efforts. Behind the carefully phrased admissions, however, remained a hard truth. One woman was gone, the other hidden behind a new name, in a gated facility funded by redirected charity dollars. Families had been denied answers, communities misled, records sealed under the guise of pastoral discretion. Janice's final published piece did not end with outrage or indictment. Instead, it closed with a simple paragraph: faith is not silence. Community is not control. And in the quiet space where doctrine overrides dignity, it is our duty to listen for the names left unsaid, because they are still there, waiting. The article was shared over 1.2 million times in the following week, cited in state legislative sessions considering reforms on religious institutional oversight, and used in a seminar at Columbia Journalism School on the role of local reporting in uncovering systemic abuse. Months later, on a spring morning, Janice returned to the bench behind St. Maria's greenhouse where she had first spoken to Caroline. The garden had begun to bloom again. She sat quietly, the weight of the story still in her chest, knowing that Emilia's voice might never be heard again, but also knowing it had never truly been erased. Thanks for staying with us through this haunting, true story-inspired mystery. If you found this story gripping, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter we uncover. What part of the story shocked you the most? Do you think Emilia will ever regain her freedom? And where are you watching from today? Drop a comment. We read every one,